The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Clarence House, as King Charles III stood at his study window, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. The weight of the crown had changed everything. But nothing had prepared him for the delicate family dynamics that would soon test the very foundations of the monarchy. What began as a routine family gathering would spiral into one of the most emotionally charged situations the palace had witnessed in decades. It was the autumn of 2023 when Camilla's sister, Annabel Elliot, first approached the newly crowned king with what seemed like a reasonable request. As an accomplished interior designer who had worked on several royal properties, Annabel believed she deserved a more prominent role within the royal household's official functions. Her decades of loyal service to the family, she argued, had earned her the right to be included in major state occasions and receive formal recognition for her contributions. Charles listened politely as Annabel outlined her aspirations during what was supposed to be a casual family dinner at Highgrove. The atmosphere in the oak-paneled dining room grew noticeably tense as she spoke about feeling overlooked and undervalued. Camilla, seated across from her sister, shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting between her husband and Annabel. She had hoped this conversation would never need to happen, but family loyalty ran deep, and Annabel had been persistent in her requests for months. The king's response was measured but firm. Royal protocol, he explained, dictated strict boundaries between personal relationships and official duties. While he appreciated Annabel's contributions to the family's private residences, expanding her role within the formal structure of the monarchy would set a dangerous precedent. The conversation ended with polite pleasantries, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. In the days that followed, Camilla found herself caught between two worlds. Her sister began making increasingly pointed comments about the royal family's treatment of the Parker Bowles clan, suggesting that despite Camilla's position as queen consort, her relatives were still viewed as outsiders. These conversations, initially private, began to reach the ears of palace staff through Annabel's growing network of contacts within royal circles. The situation escalated when Annabel's son, Ben Elliot, who had previously maintained a successful career in business, started expressing similar sentiments. As the co-founder of a luxury concierge company, Ben had occasionally provided services to wealthy clients with royal connections. He began to feel that his family's proximity to the throne should open doors that remained stubbornly closed. His frustration manifested in subtle but pointed comments during social gatherings, suggesting that the royal family was failing to fully embrace the Parker Bowles lineage. Charles became aware of these undercurrents through his private secretary, who had begun receiving reports from various sources about growing discontent within Camilla's extended family. The king's initial reaction was one of disappointment rather than anger. He had hoped that his marriage to Camilla would bring stability and harmony, not create new sources of internal conflict. The breaking point came during a weekend stay at Balmoral. Annabel had been invited as part of a larger family gathering, but her behavior throughout the visit raised serious concerns among the household staff. She was observed taking photographs in restricted areas of the castle, ostensibly for her interior design portfolio, but palace security noted that many of these images included sensitive details about royal security arrangements and private family spaces. When confronted about this breach of protocol, Annabel's response revealed the depth of her resentment. She argued that as the queen consort's sister, she should have unfettered access to royal properties, and questioned why such restrictions applied to her when they had never been explicitly outlined. Her defiant attitude shocked the household staff, who were accustomed to even the closest royal relatives showing appropriate respect for security protocols. The incident report reached Charles within hours, and his response surprised even his most senior advisors. Rather than addressing the matter directly with Annabel, or even discussing it privately with Camilla, the king chose a different approach. He began implementing what palace insiders would later describe as strategic distance, a carefully orchestrated reduction in contact with Camilla's family that would send an unmistakable message about acceptable behavior. Invitations to family gatherings that had previously been extended as a matter of course suddenly became more selective. Annabel found herself excluded from events where she had once been a regular presence. Ben's business contacts within royal circles began to receive polite but firm messages that his services would no longer be required for any events connected to the royal household, effectively cutting off a significant source of revenue and prestige. The most telling sign of Charles's displeasure came in the form of what wasn't said, rather than what was. During public appearances and formal occasions, the king's acknowledgement of Camilla's family became noticeably cooler. Where once he had made efforts to include references to his extended family through marriage, these mentions gradually disappeared from his speeches and public statements. Camilla was slow to recognize the full extent of her husband's actions. Initially, she attributed the changes to the natural evolution of royal duties and the increasing demands of kingship. However, as weeks turned into months, the pattern became undeniable. Her sister's phone calls grew more frequent and desperate as Annabelle struggled to understand why doors that had once been open were now firmly closed. The queen consort found herself in an impossible position. Her loyalty to her family was unquestionable, but her understanding of royal protocol and her respect for her husband's position as monarch created an internal conflict that became increasingly difficult to manage. She began to withdraw from family gatherings herself, finding it easier to avoid the tension than to navigate the complex emotions that arose whenever the subject of royal access came up. Palace staff noticed the change in Camilla's demeanor during this period. The woman who had once brought warmth and informality to royal functions became more reserved, particularly when family matters were discussed. Her private secretary reported that the queen consort had begun declining suggestions for events that might include her extended family, preferring to maintain separation between her royal duties and her personal relationships. The ripple effects of Charles's icy silence began to extend beyond immediate family members. Long-standing friends of the Parker Bowles family found themselves reassessing their own relationships with royal circles. Invitations that had once been routine were no longer forthcoming, and the social currency that came with royal proximity began to evaporate for those associated with Camilla's family network. The winter months brought an unexpected escalation to the growing rift within the royal household. What had begun as quiet disapproval from King Charles transformed into something far more serious when palace intelligence uncovered evidence that members of Camilla's family were sharing confidential information with external parties. The discovery would test the very foundations of trust within the monarchy and force Charles to make decisions that would have lasting consequences for his marriage and his reign. The revelation came through routine security monitoring of communications from royal properties. Ben Elliott's phone records revealed several conversations with journalists and media consultants, where he had discussed internal royal matters with a level of detail that could only have come from someone with intimate access to palace operations. While nothing explicitly treasonous had been shared, the casual nature of these disclosures represented a fundamental breach of the unwritten codes that governed royal family behavior. More disturbing still was the discovery that Annabelle had been maintaining detailed notes about her visits to royal properties, including observations about security procedures, staff routines, and private family conversations. These notes, found during a routine security sweep of guest accommodations at Clarence House, painted a picture of systematic intelligence gathering that went far beyond normal family interest. When confronted with this evidence, Charles's response was swift and uncompromising. He immediately ordered a comprehensive review of all access privileges enjoyed by Camilla's family members, effectively placing them under the same scrutiny typically reserved for potential security threats. The investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that suggested the Parker Bowles family had been treating their royal connections as a form of social and financial capital, leveraging their access for personal gain in ways that were both subtle and systematic. The king's reaction to these discoveries marked a fundamental shift in his approach to family relationships. Where once he had been willing to overlook minor indiscretions in the interest of family harmony, the evidence of systematic exploitation of royal trust triggered a response that surprised even his closest advisors with its severity. Charles had spent his entire life understanding that the monarchy's survival depended on maintaining strict boundaries between public duty and private relationships, and the violations he now faced struck at the heart of everything he had been taught to protect. Camilla's world began to crumble as she gradually learned the full extent of her family's actions. The woman who had spent years carefully building her reputation as a stabilizing influence within the royal family now faced the devastating realization that her own relatives had been undermining the institution she had sworn to serve. The private conversations she had shared with her sister about royal life, intended as harmless family gossip, had been documented and potentially shared with outsiders. The emotional toll on the queen consort became evident to those who worked closely with her. Staff members reported that Camilla had begun spending increasing amounts of time alone in her private quarters, declining social engagements, and canceling appointments with little explanation. Her usual warmth and accessibility, hallmarks of her public persona, gave way to a distant professionalism that mirrored her husband's increasingly formal approach to family matters. The palace's response to the crisis was carefully orchestrated to minimize public exposure while sending clear signals to all involved parties. Annabel Elliot found herself removed from the official list of approved contractors for royal properties, effectively ending her professional relationship with the monarchy. Ben Elliot's business connections to royal circles were systematically severed through a series of polite but firm communications that made clear his services were no longer welcome. More significantly, both siblings discovered that their access to royal events had been not just reduced but completely eliminated. Invitations to family gatherings, charity functions, and social events simply stopped arriving. When they attempted to contact palace staff directly, they were politely redirected through official channels that created bureaucratic barriers, making spontaneous contact virtually impossible. The psychological impact of this isolation became apparent as both Annabel and Ben struggled to understand the full scope of their exile. Friends within their social circle began reporting that both siblings had become increasingly bitter and resentful, with conversations dominated by complaints about royal ingratitude and speculation about their sister's inability to protect family interests. Camilla's attempts to mediate the situation only served to highlight the impossible position she now occupied. When she approached Charles about potentially softening the restrictions on her family, his response was both gentle and immovable. He explained that the monarchy's survival depended on maintaining absolute trust, and that any perception of favoritism or security weakness could have consequences that extended far beyond their personal relationships. The king's commitment to his decision became evident in his handling of public appearances during this period. Royal watchers noted that references to his extended family or family through marriage disappeared entirely from his speeches and public statements. When protocol required acknowledgement of the queen consort's background, these mentions became increasingly formal and distant, lacking the warmth that had previously characterized his public discussion of his wife's family. The emotional distance between Charles and Camilla began to affect their public interactions as well. While both maintained the polished professionalism expected of senior royals, observers noted subtle changes in their body language and interaction patterns. The easy familiarity that had made their public appearances so compelling was replaced by a more formal dynamic that suggested underlying tension despite their obvious efforts to maintain appearances. Palace staff found themselves navigating an increasingly complex emotional landscape as they witnessed the personal cost of the king's decisions. The man who had always prized family harmony was now enforcing a separation that clearly caused him personal pain, but his commitment to royal duty superseded all other considerations. Staff members reported observing Charles in private moments, staring out windows or sitting quietly in his study, clearly wrestling with the emotional consequences of his actions. The situation reached a critical point when Camilla received a desperate phone call from her sister, pleading for intervention and expressing confusion about why the family had been so completely cut off from royal circles. The conversation, which took place in Camilla's private sitting room at Clarence House, was overheard by staff members who later reported that the queen consort's response was both heartbreaking and revealing. Camilla's explanation to her sister marked the first time she had openly acknowledged the full scope of the situation. She revealed that the palace had evidence of behavior that went beyond mere social missteps, explaining that the systematic documentation and sharing of royal information had created security concerns that could not be overlooked. Her voice, according to those who overheard the conversation, carried a mixture of sadness and resignation that suggested she had finally accepted the irreversible nature of the breach. The aftermath of this conversation marked the beginning of a new phase in the crisis. Camilla's acceptance of the situation's gravity coincided with her husband's realization that his actions, while necessary for institutional protection, were causing profound personal suffering for the woman he loved. The king began to grapple with the question of whether absolute adherence to royal protocol was worth the emotional cost to his marriage and his wife's relationship with her family. This internal conflict manifested in increasingly private discussions between Charles and his most trusted advisors about finding ways to protect the monarchy while minimizing the personal cost to Camilla. However, These conversations consistently returned to the fundamental reality that any perceived weakness in royal security or favoritism toward family members could have consequences that extended far beyond their personal situation, potentially affecting the monarchy's relationship with government security services and public trust. The spring of 2024 brought an unexpected development that would ultimately reshape the entire dynamic between King Charles, Camilla, and her estranged family members. A medical emergency involving Camilla's elderly aunt created a situation that forced all parties to confront the human cost of the ongoing estrangement, leading to revelations that would fundamentally alter everyone's understanding of the crisis and its potential resolution. Lady Mary Parker Bowles, Camilla's beloved aunt, who had been instrumental in raising her during difficult periods of her childhood, suffered a severe stroke that left her hospitalized and in critical condition. The news reached Camilla through official channels rather than family communication, highlighting just how complete the separation had become. When the Queen Consort requested permission to visit her aunt, accompanied by her sister Annabelle, Charles faced the most challenging decision of his reign thus far. The king's initial response reflected the rigid boundaries he had established over the previous months. Royal protocol dictated that any interaction with estranged family members required security clearance and official oversight, even in circumstances involving medical emergencies. However, as Charles witnessed his wife's genuine distress and her desperate need to reconcile with her family during this crisis, he began to question whether his approach had been too absolute in its application. The hospital visit that eventually took place marked the first time Camilla and Annabelle had been in the same room for nearly 6 months. Palace security maintained a discreet but visible presence, creating an atmosphere of tension that made natural family interaction almost impossible. However, the gravity of their aunt's condition forced both sisters to focus on matters far more important than royal protocol and family grievances. During the long hours spent in the hospital waiting room, a conversation finally took place that would begin to unravel the complex web of misunderstandings and resentments that had driven the family apart. Annabelle, confronted with the reality of potentially losing someone who had been central to her life, began to acknowledge behaviors that she had previously dismissed as harmless family networking. The systematic documentation of royal activities, the casual sharing of private information, and the sense of entitlement that had characterized her approach to royal access were revealed as symptoms of a deeper psychological struggle with her sister's transformation from family member to royal figure. The breakthrough came when Annabelle broke down emotionally, admitting that she had never fully processed the reality of Camilla's new role and the responsibilities it entailed. Her actions, she revealed, had been driven not by malicious intent, but by a desperate attempt to maintain relevance and connection to a sister whose life had become increasingly distant and formal. The documentation and information sharing had been unconscious attempts to prove to herself that she still belonged in Camilla's world, even as that world had fundamentally changed in ways she couldn't accept. Ben Elliott's arrival at the hospital later that evening added another layer of complexity to the emotional reconciliation taking place. His conversation with his mother and aunt revealed similar patterns of behavior, driven by confusion and resentment, rather than deliberate betrayal. The younger man's business connections and casual sharing of royal information had been motivated by a desire to maintain social status and professional relevance in a world where his family's royal connection was his most valuable asset. These revelations reached King Charles through detailed security reports that painted a very different picture of the family dynamics than had previously been understood. Rather than deliberate attempts to exploit royal access for personal gain, the evidence suggested a family struggling to adapt to circumstances that had fundamentally altered their relationship with someone they loved. This new understanding created space for Charles to reconsider his approach, while maintaining the security and protocol standards essential to royal function. The king's decision to visit the hospital himself, announced without prior consultation with his security team or private secretary, shocked the entire palace establishment. His appearance in the intensive care unit waiting room, where he found his wife and her family maintaining their vigil, marked the first direct interaction he had had with the Parker Bowles family since implementing the policy of strategic distance months earlier. The conversation that followed was brief but transformative. Charles spoke directly to both Annabelle and Ben, acknowledging their devotion to family while clearly outlining the boundaries that must exist between personal relationships and royal duty. However, his tone was markedly different from the cold formality that had characterized previous interactions. He expressed understanding of their struggle to adapt to changed circumstances while maintaining firm expectations about future behavior. More importantly, the king's presence at the hospital sent a clear signal to palace staff and the wider royal establishment that the complete estrangement from Camilla's family was ending. His willingness to appear publicly in a situation that involved them suggested a softening of his position, even while maintaining essential security and protocol requirements. The weeks that followed brought gradual but noticeable changes in the royal household's approach to the Parker Bowles family. While the complete access they had once enjoyed was never restored, a more limited but clearly defined relationship began to emerge. Annabelle's professional relationship with royal properties remained terminated, but social contact was slowly re-established under carefully controlled circumstances. Ben Elliot found himself subject to ongoing security monitoring but was no longer completely excluded from family functions. His business connections to royal circles remained severed, but personal attendance at significant family events became possible again, albeit under much more formal circumstances than had previously been the case. The most significant change was in Camilla herself, who emerged from the crisis with a clearer understanding of her role as a bridge between her royal duties and family relationships. She began to take a more active role in managing these connections, establishing clear boundaries and expectations that protected both the monarchy's interests and her family's emotional needs. King Charles's handling of the resolution demonstrated a maturation in his approach to kingship that impressed even his critics within the establishment. His ability to maintain essential royal standards while finding ways to address the human cost of his decisions showed a leadership style that balanced institutional needs with personal compassion. The ultimate resolution came during a private family gathering at Highgrove in late summer, where the king formally outlined the new framework that would govern future relationships with the Parker Bowles family. The terms were clear and non-negotiable. Any future violations of royal privacy or security would result in permanent exclusion, but good faith efforts to respect boundaries would be met with appropriate family inclusion. This gathering marked the first time in over a year that the entire extended family had been together, and the emotional healing that took place surprised everyone involved. Camilla's aunt, who had recovered sufficiently to attend despite ongoing health challenges, served as a powerful reminder of the importance of family connections that transcend even the most serious disagreements. The long-term impact of this crisis and its resolution extended far beyond the immediate family dynamics. Palace staff noted that King Charles had developed a more nuanced approach to balancing royal duty with personal relationships, while Camilla had emerged as a stronger advocate for maintaining family connections within appropriate boundaries. The entire episode served as a powerful lesson about the complex challenges facing modern monarchy, where ancient protocols must coexist with contemporary family dynamics. The king's ultimate success in finding a resolution that protected institutional interests while preserving essential family relationships demonstrated the kind of leadership that would define his reign in years to come.